In the year 1882, the town of Harrow Creek was a place where time moved a little slower and shadows stretched a little longer. Nestled deep in the Appalachian valleys of West Virginia, this coal town was carved out of rugged hills and cloaked in the thick, ever-hanging mist of early morning. From a distance, it looked like a picture, perfect settlement, brick storefronts with hand-painted signs, horse-drawn carriages clattering along cobblestone roads, and smoke curling lazily from chimney tops. Church bells rang every Sunday morning, and children played in the fields without a care in the world. But Harrow Creek, like many towns born out of industry and ambition, was built not just on the strength of men, but on the silence of those who feared to speak. The heartbeat of Harrow Creek was the Harrow Creek Mining Company, a coal empire that employed almost every able-bodied man in the town. Its tunnels snaked under the mountains like veins, pumping coal to the surface day and night. Men worked dangerous shifts with little rest, often for pennies a day. Children as young as 10 labored beside their fathers, coughing black dust from their lungs before they even hit puberty. On the surface, the town appeared to prosper. New homes were built, shops opened, and the Mayor William Copperfield was celebrated for bringing jobs and order to the region. He was polished, charming, and rarely seen without his pristine coat and golden pocket watch. Locals often said, "If William Copperfield shakes your hand, you'll be blessed for a week." But behind the handshake and the smile was a man walking a tightrope between civic duty and corporate loyalty. What few knew at the time was that Harrow Creek was sitting on a powder keg. You see, the mining company didn't just run the coal fields. They ran everything: the law enforcement, the judges, the newspapers. Even the clergy, in some cases. No one crossed them without consequences. Accidents in the mine were covered up, wages were cut with no notice, protests disappeared before they started. If you asked too many questions, you were either bought off or you were gone by morning. And yet, despite this, the townspeople endured. They worked because they had no choice. They smiled because they were expected to. Fear became a silent language in Harrow Creeks, spoken in glances, in hurried footsteps, and in the hushed prayers of mothers who watched their husbands walk into the mines each morning, unsure if they'd return. In this world of quiet corruption stood one woman who didn't quite fit the mold: Martha Copperfield, the mayor's wife. Martha was not born in Harrow Creek. She came from Charleston, educated, elegant, and fiercely intelligent. While most women of the time were content with hosting social gatherings and keeping to domestic duties, Martha had a mind that refused to be idle. She read newspapers from outside towns, kept journals, and asked questions that made the town's elite uneasy. She walked the streets of Harrow Creek not like a politician's wife, but like a woman on a mission. She visited families of injured miners. She brought books to children. She sat in church not for appearances, but to listen. And most dangerously of all, she started to notice things others pretended not to see. Why were so many miners disappearing? Why did accident reports never reach the papers? Why did her husband come home late some nights, tense and silent? Martha sensed a rot beneath the surface of the town's polite smiles and Sunday speeches. What made Martha truly unique and dangerous wasn't just her curiosity, it was her conviction. She believed that truth mattered. That justice wasn't a word for sermons, but a responsibility for all, especially those in power. And though she was the mayor's wife, she refused to let that role silence her conscience. She started writing letters, asking questions, speaking quietly at first, to the wives of the miners and to the workers themselves. And what she discovered was darker than she could have imagined. But in 1882, Harrow Creek was not ready for a woman like Martha Copperfield. A woman who saw the cracks in its perfect image, a woman who refused to be blindfolded by privilege, a woman who, in a town built on silence, chose to speak. What no one knew then was that her search for the truth would come at the ultimate cost. And Harrow Creek, beautiful, broken Harrow Creek, would never be the same again. In an era when women were expected to speak only when spoken to, Martha Copperfield dared to raise her voice, and not just in whispers, but with unwavering conviction. She was the wife of Mayor William Copperfield, and to most, that meant she had a life of luxury, respect, and influence. But behind closed doors, Martha saw through the polished veneer of Harrow Creek. She saw the fatigue in the eyes of miners. She heard the muffled cries of widows, and she read the fear written across the faces of children who knew, far too young, what loss felt like. Most women of her standing busied themselves with garden parties, sewing circles, and proper etiquette. But Martha, she buried herself in books, in ledgers, in letters. She was always reading, always questioning, and what she saw disturbed her. It began with a name, a man who worked for the Harrow Creek Mining Company. His widow, Caroline Bray, had knocked on Martha's door one winter morning with frostbitten hands and hollow cheeks. Her husband, Thomas Bray, had died in a mining accident that was never reported in the local paper. Caroline had been promised compensation from the company. She received nothing. That single story sparked a fire in Martha. She started visiting homes in secret, speaking to the wives of injured or deceased miners. Listening, documenting, within weeks she had collected a list of over 18 names, workers who had died mysteriously or vanished altogether. None of them had been officially recognized, not by the company. Not by the mayor's office, not even by the town's own newspaper. Martha didn't understand at first. How could such suffering be ignored? But the more she uncovered, the clearer the picture became. The Harrow Creek Mining Company was not just a business. It was a regime. It paid the town sheriff's salary. It funded the judge's estate. It made generous donations to the church and to the mayor's office. In return, it received silence, loyalty, and protection. Anyone who dared to question its authority was quickly shut down, some by bribes, others by fear, and some by more permanent methods. But Martha had something the company didn't expect: courage coupled with clarity. She was not motivated by rebellion or revenge. She wasn't trying to be a hero. She was simply a woman who believed in what was right, and she could no longer sleep at night knowing how many people were suffering in the shadows while those in power looked the other way. So she made a plan. Martha began keeping a journal disguised as a book of recipes. Hidden within its pages were handwritten accounts, copied letters, and notes detailing every conversation she had with miners' families. She tracked pay discrepancies, safety violations, and false records filed by the mining company. She even managed to sneak into her husband's study and make copies of sealed documents, agreements, and letters that clearly showed a web of corruption connecting the company to the mayor's office. She knew she was walking a dangerous path. Every step forward brought her closer to a truth that others had been paid to bury. But Martha had something inside her that would not let her stop. A moral backbone, stronger than fear. She wasn't just seeking justice for the dead. She was trying to protect the living, the wives, the children, the unborn generations who would inherit the town's silence if she did nothing. And slowly her mission took shape. She contacted Samuel Greaves, the editor of a small but independent printing press on the edge of town. He was one of the few who hadn't been bought off. Together, they planned to publish and expose. The headline was to read, "Blood Beneath the Black Gold, the Real Cost of Harrow Creek's Prosperity." They agreed to meet on the evening of September 12th, 1882. Martha would bring all the evidence she had collected. Samuel would prepare the first prints that very night. She dressed plainly that day, left the house with her leather-bound folder tucked under her arm, and with every step she took toward the truth, she knew the danger she was walking into. But she also knew that cowardice had claimed too many souls already in Harrow Creek. She would not be another one. Her final journal entry, later found hidden under a floorboard, read, "They think silence keeps us safe, but silence is the very thing that has buried us alive. If I am not here tomorrow, then let this speak in my place. Someone must always speak." Martha Copperfield wasn't just a woman of her time. She was a woman ahead of it. In a world that demanded her obedience, she chose resistance. In a town drowning in secrets, she chose the light of truth, even if it cost her everything. And that, more than anything, made her dangerous. It was the evening of September 12th, 1882, and the streets of Harrow Creek were unusually still. The sun had already slipped behind the Appalachian hills, casting long shadows across the town. A chill hung in the air, the kind that whispered warnings no one dared to voice. The gas lamps lining Main Street flickered dimly, their golden glow distorted by the rising coal dust. Shops had closed early. The bar at Crossman's Inn was silent. Even the stray dogs that usually barked through the night had gone quiet, and somewhere in that silence Martha Copperfield vanished. Earlier that day, she had moved with unusual urgency. She wore a plain brown shawl instead of her usual elegant overcoat, a deliberate choice to avoid drawing attention. She had told her housekeeper she was going to the church for evening prayer, but that was a lie. Tucked beneath her arm was a worn leather folder, thick with notes, letters, copied contracts, and testimony. Everything she had gathered about the Harrow Creek Mining Company's corruption and its ties to the local government. This was not just evidence, it was a weapon, the kind that, if seen by the right eyes, could dismantle power and enrage those who held it. Her destination was a small brick building at the edge of town, home to the independent printing press run by Samuel Greaves. Samuel was one of the last remaining journalists who hadn't been bribed, threatened, or silenced. He was waiting for her with his press ink warm and the layout of the newspaper's front page cleared for her story. The plan was simple. Martha would deliver the documents, Samuel would typeset the article, and by morning, Harrow Creek would wake up to a front page that could shake the walls of power. But she never made it. According to one eyewitness, a boy named Jonas Bell, who was delivering milk nearby, Martha was seen entering the alley behind Greaves' print shop just before 8:00 p.m. She looked over her shoulder twice, clutching the folder tightly. That was the last confirmed sighting of her alive. At 9:17 p.m., townspeople noticed a strange glow in the sky. Smoke began to rise from the east edge of Harrow Creek. Within minutes, flames engulfed the printing press. Fire crews arrived too late to save it. The building was reduced to rubble and ash. No bodies were found in the wreckage, but Samuel Greaves was never seen again. The next morning, whispers began to circulate. The mayor's wife had not returned home. Some assumed she had fled. Others feared worse. The townspeople waited for a public statement, but none came. Mayor William Copperfield appeared before a hastily assembled press conference and stated solemnly that his wife had likely become lost during an evening walk and may have suffered an accident in the wilderness. Search parties were sent to the woods. A reward was posted, but those who truly knew Martha didn't believe she had simply wandered off. She was far too deliberate, too careful. 5 days passed. Then, on September 17th, a young fisherman named Lyle Duncan discovered a body floating in the reservoir behind the mining site. It was Martha. Her face was bruised. Her hands were bound. A crimson ribbon was tied tightly around her wrist, an unmistakable symbol used by the mining company to mark individuals who had betrayed their silence. It was meant as a warning. A message to others: this is what happens when you speak. The official cause of death was listed as accidental drowning following an apparent robbery. A necklace she wore was missing, and local officials claimed she had been the victim of random violence. But no one believed it. The stolen necklace was a distraction. The ribbon said everything. The most damning piece of the puzzle was what wasn't found: the leather folder, the documents, the letters, everything she had gathered, gone. The press shop was ashes. Samuel Greaves had disappeared, and the only voice that could expose the truth had been permanently silenced. Yet, even in death, Martha's absence spoke louder than most could handle. Some townspeople claimed to see strangers in black coats lurking around her house in the days before her disappearance. Others said they heard footsteps behind the church the night of the fire, but no one could prove anything. And those who asked too many questions were met with stern warnings or found themselves without work. What began as a mission to uncover the truth had become a funeral without justice, and in the heart of Harrow Creek, the message was clear: this town protected its secrets, even if it meant burying the innocent with them. But not everyone was ready to forget, and not everyone was willing to stay silent, because sometimes the dead leave behind echoes, and Martha Copperfield's echo was only just beginning to be heard. After the death of Martha Copperfield, Harrow Creek wrapped itself in silence like a funeral shroud. People stopped asking questions. The whispers that once flowed behind closed doors were snuffed out like candles in a storm. There were no protests, no public mourning, no marches through the streets. Her funeral was quiet, attended only by a few family members and church elders. The townsfolk stayed home, not because they didn't care, but because they were afraid. Fear had long ruled Harrow Creek. It crept through the coal-stained streets, sat in church pews, and lingered over every dinner table conversation. After Martha's body was found and Samuel Greaves vanished, the message was loud and clear: speak the truth, and you will pay with your life. Mayor William Copperfield resigned just weeks after his wife's death. He issued no final statement. One morning, his home was found locked, the drapes drawn, and the mayor gone. Some claimed he had fled west. Others whispered that he had been removed by the same men who had taken Martha, but no one really knew. The Harrow Creek Mining Company continued operating as if nothing had happened. A new mayor, meek and compliant, was installed. The coal kept flowing, and Martha's name was never spoken again, at least not by most. But while the town was busy forgetting, one young boy remembered everything. His name was Elias Rowe, the son of a coal miner who had died in a tunnel collapse 2 years prior. Elias was only 12 when he first met Martha. She had come to their house with a basket of bread and a coat for his mother, but she didn't just drop the items and leave. She stayed. She sat with his grieving mother, asked about their family, and more importantly, listened. To Elias, Martha wasn't just the mayor's wife. She was the only adult who had ever treated his pain like it mattered. She saw people, and Elias never forgot that. The night Martha disappeared, Elias had seen her. He was hiding behind a stack of crates near the alley beside Samuel Greaves' print shop, carving birds into a piece of scrap wood with a penknife. He watched her walk by, clutching a brown folder close to her chest, eyes darting left and right. He remembered the fear in her walk. He remembered the sound of footsteps behind her, and he remembered the men in black coats who followed. He wanted to tell someone, but what could a boy say in a town where even adults vanished for speaking too much? So he kept quiet, but he didn't forget. Instead, he started writing. Elias had a broken typewriter his father had once salvaged from a scrap heap. The S key stuck, and the ink ribbon was faded, but it worked. He began typing everything he knew, what he'd seen, what Martha had told his mother, what other miners' families had whispered to her in the months before her death. He called it The Woman Who Knew Too Much. It wasn't a book. Not yet, just pages, dozens of them, stacked in a shoebox beneath his bed. Over the years, he added to it. Every time he heard a name that vanished, every time he saw something that didn't add up, every time he remembered the look on Martha's face, that strange mix of courage and sorrow, he typed. As he grew older, Elias became a schoolteacher in a neighboring town. His voice grew stronger, and so did his conviction. While Harrow Creek tried to erase the past, Elias preserved it, line by line. In 1903, at the age of 33, Elias finally compiled all of his notes into a small, privately printed pamphlet. Only 100 copies were made. He mailed them quietly to churches, universities, and journalists across the state under a pseudonym, E.R. Carter. The pamphlet was titled, Truth in the Shadow, the Harrow Creek Cover-Up. It wasn't a bestseller, it didn't cause riots, but it began to stir the waters. A handful of young lawyers took an interest. A few brave reporters started asking questions. Over time, the story that Harrow Creek tried to bury began to surface again. People started writing letters. Survivors came forward. And slowly, Martha Copperfield's name re-entered history, not as a victim, but as a woman who had fought for justice when no one else would. Elias never returned to Harrow Creek. But before his death, he donated his original manuscript, letters, and all remaining documents to the West Virginia Historical Society, ensuring that what the town tried to forget would be remembered forever. Because while a town can bury a body, it cannot bury a righteous legacy. Not when even one voice, no matter how small, keeps telling the truth. And in the end, it was a boy with a typewriter, not a mayor, not a judge, not a company executive, who made sure that the truth outlived the lie. Time, they say, has a way of burying secrets, but sometimes those very secrets claw their way back into the light, when no one expects it, and when the world is finally ready to hear the truth. It had been 50 years since the mysterious death of Martha Copperfield, the former mayor's wife who had dared to expose the corruption that ran through Harrow Creek like poison in a well. For half a century, her name had lingered only in rumors and hushed stories, carried in the margins of journals, passed quietly between aging coal miners who remembered her kindness but feared her fate. The mining company that once ruled the town with an iron grip had long since faded. The coal had run thin, the tunnels had collapsed, the once powerful executives were gone, some dead, others moved to cities far away. Harrow Creek had shrunk to a shell of what it once was. The once booming streets were now quiet, overgrown with weeds and stained with the remnants of the past, but the past wasn't done. In 1932, during the height of the Great Depression, a frail and dying man named Joseph Barrow was admitted to a small charity hospital just outside of Charleston, West Virginia. He was 73 years old, suffering from black lung disease, and had no known family. A priest had been called to offer last rites, but before the priest could speak, Joseph, his breathing ragged and his hands trembling, asked for pen and paper. "I have to confess," he whispered, "it's been 50 years. The nurse who attended him later described his eyes as haunted, like he'd been carrying a ghost on his back for decades, and what he wrote on those yellowed hospital sheets would become the final missing piece of a story long buried. Joseph Barrow had once been a security enforcer for the Harrow Creek Mining Company. His job wasn't to protect, his job was to silence. He had been one of 2 men ordered to intercept Martha Copperfield on the night of September 12, 1882. Their orders: retrieve the leather folder and ensure she never spoke again. He confessed that they followed her to the alley behind the printing press. He wrote how she turned to face them, not with fear, but with fierce defiance. "You know what you're doing is wrong," she had told them. "One day someone will speak louder than your fear." He said they hesitated. She pleaded with them to take the folder but let her go, but the orders were clear, and the fear of crossing the company was greater than their guilt. Martha had fought, she had screamed, but there was no one nearby to hear, and when it was over, they dragged her body to the reservoir near the mine and tied a crimson ribbon around her wrist, an unmistakable mark of betrayal in the eyes of the company. Joseph said he had nightmares for years, that her face would appear in his sleep, whispering, "Tell the truth." But he was a coward, he admitted. He stayed silent. He kept collecting paychecks and the folder she carried. It was burned the very next morning, by order of the company director himself. The confession was signed, dated, and witnessed by the attending nurse and priest. By the time the press got hold of it, Joseph Barrow had already passed. But the damage, or perhaps the healing, had begun. Newspapers across the state ran the headline, "Martha Copperfield's murder confessed corruption, cover-up, and silence broken after 50 years." Suddenly, the dusty name of a woman long forgotten surged back into the public eye. People began to ask, who was she really? What did she die trying to say? Interest in the story exploded. University students researched her. Journalists reprinted excerpts from Elias Rowe's pamphlet, The Woman Who Knew Too Much, which had until then been archived in only 2 libraries in the entire state. Labor unions across West Virginia demanded that the state formally recognize Martha's bravery. One union leader famously said, "If she had lived, our fathers might have died safer." Within a year, a historical inquest was opened by the state. Though most of the original perpetrators were dead or missing, the findings were clear. Martha Copperfield had been murdered in connection to a corporate and political conspiracy. Her death had been deliberately covered up. The mining company had manipulated public records, and public officials had remained complicit through silence. It was the first time in the state's history that a murdered woman, once labeled simply a mayor's wife, was officially declared a whistleblower and victim of industrial corruption. To honor her, a statue was commissioned by labor organizations and civil rights groups, not in Harrow Creek, which still resisted the full truth, but in Charleston, where Martha had been born. The statue depicts Martha standing tall, clutching a folder to her chest, looking forward with wind blowing through her skirt, a symbol of resistance. At her feet, engraved in stone, is the quote from her final journal entry: "They think silence keeps us safe, but silence is the very thing that has buried us alive. Time may pass, but truth never expires." The story of Martha Copperfield is not just a historical tale filled with tragedy and mystery. It is a mirror reflecting our present and a map guiding our future. In 1882, Martha Copperfield stood alone in a town ruled by fear. She wasn't a politician. She wasn't a revolutionary. She didn't carry a weapon or raise a banner. What she carried was far more powerful: conviction. She was a woman who saw injustice and chose not to look away. In an age when women were expected to stay quiet and defer to power, Martha became a threat simply because she refused to be silent. That truth alone is a powerful lesson in a world where silence is still often safer than honesty. Martha's story matters today because her struggle is still ours. In every corner of the world, there are still people who are afraid to speak. Workers afraid to report abuse for fear of losing their jobs. Whistleblowers silenced by corporate power. Victims of injustice asked to stay quiet for the sake of peace. Journalists threatened, truth tellers punished, families pressured into burying the past. Martha's courage reminds us that justice is not convenient, it's costly, and yet, if no one is willing to pay the price, injustice flourishes. She didn't act out of ambition or fame. There was nothing to gain and everything to lose. But she acted because she believed that truth mattered, even if it didn't save her. Her murder was designed to be the end of the story, but history is full of examples where the death of one brave soul becomes the beginning of something greater. What they tried to silence in Martha only echoed louder in the hearts of those who followed. It stirred the conscience of a 12-year-old boy, Elias Rowe, who grew into a man determined to share her story. It inspired journalists, labor unions, and future generations to speak out. It eventually forced a reckoning with a forgotten history that had been buried for decades, and that is the legacy of courage. It outlives fear. Too often, we're told that one person can't make a difference. But Martha proves that one person, armed with truth, can change everything, not immediately, not painlessly, but permanently. She planted seeds that would take 50 years to bloom. And that's another reason her story matters, because not all victories come in our lifetime. Some of the most meaningful things we do may never be recognized while we're alive. We may never see the fruit of our sacrifices. But if they are rooted in truth, in justice, and in moral clarity, they will take root. They will grow. They will be remembered. Her life also challenges us to ask deeper questions. What are we willing to risk for the truth? What lies have we accepted because confronting them is uncomfortable? Who are we failing to defend because it's easier to walk away? Martha didn't just fight corruption, she fought complacency, the willingness of good people to look the other way, the urge to protect status and reputation over human life. That is a battle still raging today, in politics, in business, in families, and even in our personal lives. And it begs this truth. Every injustice that is tolerated becomes a permission slip for the next one. The people of Harrow Creek eventually forgot her, not because they were evil, but because they were afraid. Martha teaches us that fear doesn't have to control us, that courage isn't the absence of fear, it's the decision to stand anyway. Her story is a call to action, to speak when silence is expected, to stand when others sit down, to believe that even in a world full of shadows, light has power. If Martha Copperfield had stayed silent, no one would have blamed her. But because she didn't, generations were changed, truth was revealed, injustice was confronted, a legacy was born. In a world obsessed with fame, Martha left no statue during her lifetime, no headlines, no parade, but what she left was something much deeper, a legacy of moral courage that outlasted her enemies, her era, and even her own voice. And today that voice speaks again, not through her own words, but through ours. Every time we choose honesty over comfort, every time we defend the weak instead of protecting the powerful, every time we say, "This is wrong," even when it costs us something, we honor Martha Copperfield. Because the moral of her story is this: a life lived with courage is never wasted, and the truth, no matter how long it sleeps, will always rise. In the shadowed past of 1882 Harrow Creek, one woman's voice still echoes through time: Martha Copperfield, the mayor's wife, the truth teller and the martyr. Her story did not end the night she disappeared. In many ways, that's when it truly began. This story isn't merely a murder mystery or a faded tale of small-town secrets. It's a warning, a lesson, and above all, a reminder that truth, no matter how deeply buried, always finds its way back to the surface. Martha's life mattered because she lived with conviction in a time of conformity. She stood up not just against criminals, but against the far more dangerous enemies: silence, complicity, and collective cowardice. In an age where women were expected to stay quiet, where towns protected their own reputations more than their values, Martha chose a different path, a path of conscience over comfort. That choice cost her everything. Yet what Harrow Creek tried to forget, time refused to erase. So why does her story still matter today? Because Martha's story isn't just about 1882, it's about every year after. It's about us. It matters because we still live in a world where speaking the truth can cost you your job, your peace, your safety. It matters because people are still pressured to stay silent in the face of injustice, whether it's in homes, workplaces, schools, or governments. The forces that silenced Martha, fear, power, and public denial, still live among us, but Martha teaches us that one voice can disturb the silence, even when it's punished, even when it's lost, because silence doesn't mean the end. Sometimes it's the beginning of a deeper echo. Her courage should disturb us because it exposes how many of us would have stayed quiet in her place, but it should also inspire us because it shows how one ordinary person can change the legacy of an entire town. Martha had no army, she had no title of power, but she had clarity, she had principle, she had enough strength to stand alone, and that's all it ever takes. Her story matters because it was almost erased on purpose. The town didn't just forget her, they chose to. They buried her memory to protect their pride, and in doing so they committed a second crime, the murder of remembrance. Yet one boy, Eliza, remembered. One soul kept the truth alive, and that's another vital lesson. Truth needs caretakers. In every generation, someone must be brave enough to carry the memory forward, to speak when others are silent, to say what needs to be said even when no one wants to hear it. Martha's life calls out to every young woman told she's too much for speaking up. It whispers strength to every whistleblower afraid to reveal what they know. It stands beside every individual choosing integrity over popularity, truth over comfort. Her legacy shows that justice doesn't always come quickly. Sometimes the seeds of truth take decades to bloom, but they bloom all the same, nurtured by memory, watered by courage, and fed by the quiet persistence of those who refuse to forget. And still, after 50 years, when the truth resurfaced, what remained was not her disappearance, but her defiance, not her silence, but her stand, not the pain she endured, but the power she possessed. So what truly is the moral of Martha's story? It's this: that silence in the face of evil is its accomplice. That truth is not determined by popularity, but by principle. That legacy isn't built by fame, but by doing what is right when it's hardest. Her death was a tragedy, but her life was a triumph of moral clarity. And now, generations later, as we face our own battles against corruption, oppression, and moral fatigue, Martha's story serves as a compass. A call, a challenge. It dares us to ask, what would I have done if I were Martha? And perhaps more importantly, what will I do now that I know her story? Because the truth didn't die with Martha Copperfield. It lived, it waited, and now it speaks again, not through scandal, not through vengeance, but through memory, message, and moral clarity. Her voice is ours now, and we must carry it forward, not just in words, but in action. Because truth can be buried, but it can't be killed. Because history can forget, but conscience remembers. And because Martha Copperfield mattered then, just as she matters now.